We hope our prisons can do two things for us: keep our communities safe by separating violent criminals from us, and change the course of criminals' lives for the better. But what if prisons are doing neither? Joining me today to explore these questions is Maya Schenwar, Editor-in-Chief of Truth Out, an independent social justice news website. She is also the author of Locked Down, Locked Out: Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better. Welcome, Maya.
What the research suggests about the pre-prison lives of the incarcerated, and I think particularly useful for people who would tend to follow the argument that those who have broken laws, in some sense, need to be punished, and how, if we do pay attention to what the pre-prison lives of the incarcerated are, how that shouldn't be equated to being sort of soft on crime.
Yeah, I think I would start by thinking about a slightly unrelated or seemingly unrelated idea, which is the recidivism rate. The fact that people who go to prison within 3 years, once they're released, are very likely to go back. So more than 2/3 of people coming out will be rearrested within 3 years. And so when we think about that, we can take a step back and say, okay, even if we believed that the purpose of the prison system was to correct or rehabilitate, it's not doing that. It's not preventing future incarceration. And so thinking about, well, this is partially a result of what the system does, but it's also a result of why people are there. So we need to start thinking about why people are committing the crimes they're committing in the first place. I think that the pre-prison lives of the incarcerated are bound up with this idea of, well, what are we doing as a society structurally that's resulting in people breaking the law? Well, some of the crimes people are committing are survival crimes. Some of them are things that they're doing in order to put food on the table for themselves and their families. This is a large number of crimes, and actually some of the crimes that fall into that drug category absolutely count as survival crimes. People sell drugs because good jobs are not available in their community, or jobs that are legal are not available in their community, and certainly not jobs that are capable of sustaining a family. Many times theft falls along those lines, robbery. All of these things, people are doing them many times to survive. They're not doing them because they think they would be fun. Of course, drug possession, a victimless crime, that's something people are doing not because they're deviant or because they want to inflict this on society, but because A, they might just want to use drugs, and that's not something that's necessarily criminal, or B, they might be addicted to those drugs. And so thinking about, okay, the motivating factors behind those crimes, the things that people are doing before they go to prison, I think that those factors need to be taken into account. We don't talk very often about motives unless it's a murder, but most crimes are not murder, and many times the motive is about sustaining either a good life or just a life for the people involved.
So let's shift gears and talk about restorative justice and a very different way of seeing harm that individuals do to a community, and ways that communities can respond to try and make things okay again. What is restorative justice, and how does it alter sort of the traditional victim and perpetrator relationship?
Well, it's happening in an increasing number of communities, and especially in juvenile courts, it's happening. It's also happening, though, and this is, to me, one of the most exciting ways this is playing out. It's happening even before the court process would get involved. It's happening as an intervention that people are taking in situations where they don't call the police. And actually, in most situations where harm happens, people don't call the police. we don't talk about this when we talk about the criminal justice system, but most crimes aren't reported. And so people deal with them in other ways. Sometimes they deal with them by not dealing with them. But in a lot of situations, the way restorative justice is playing out is communities taking things into their own hands. And so to me, that's kind of the most exciting incarnation. However, there are situations where restorative justice is happening within the court system, particularly in juvenile courts. And one situation that I write about that's happening in Montana, there's this county in Montana where their juvenile recidivism rate was so high that they kind of did a double take when they saw it come out in 2009, and they decided to go with a completely different approach to dealing with youth crime. And they went with restorative justice for every juvenile offender, starting in 2009, assuming that the victims agreed to it. And almost always the victims agree. And this is, by the way, a majority Republican county, a place where you would not expect this kind of thing to unfold. Right. But they realized that prison wasn't working. And so this started playing out, and what they've seen is a dramatic drop in recidivism. And what's done is the victims and the offenders and community members who are directly impacted or closely related to the people involved are brought together, and they talk to each other, and they tell their stories. And in particular, the victim is able to speak to their experience and say, this is how what you did impacted me. And the person who did the harm has to sit there and listen to that, which is sometimes immensely painful.
I would imagine.
And so once that happens, eventually the person who did harm talks about what they did and their background and how they came to be at that place. And after this long process of storytelling, eventually what happens is they work toward an accountability agreement. And the idea of that is that the victim gets to say, there aren't any bounds. There's not any kind of prescribed range of sentences, or what have you. The victim is able to say, these are the things that I need to help me heal and to help me feel that violence or harm or whatever happened could be prevented in the future. The community is also able to say, well, this is what we need to feel like we could prevent this kind of violence in the future, both with this person, this particular person that did harm, and more widely as a community. So they start working toward what an agreement would look like, and eventually they come away with some very concrete things that everyone's going to do, and particularly the person who did the harm. And sometimes the things that people ask for are actually much bigger than the things that the offender would be required to do if they were incarcerated. And I think sometimes people say, oh, this is soft on crime. No, it's actually something that addresses harm in a way that's much more effective and that actually gets at the problem at hand, rather than just prescribing this blanket solution like, okay, everything from marijuana possession to murder has the same consequence, to varying degrees. That doesn't really make any sense.
Right. So again, looking at from a very structural perspective on what surrounds us on a daily basis, and how we deal with harm and how we create justice. And I guess that leads into my last question for you, and that is, in terms of sort of engaging in a conversation about what we can imagine a post-prison America looking like. What do you imagine sort of average citizens like myself can do to become involved in the work for a more just justice system?
Well, I think that there are a few different levels to that. And the most important thing that I think people can do, and I change my mind on this like every few days, just because there are so many great movements happening. But I think that the best thing that people can do really is look at what's going on a community level, in their kind of immediate vicinity, because there are amazing national movements happening on the decarceration front and that kind of thing. And certainly it's important to advocate for laws and legislation and changing the way we do things on that level. But the real grassroots movements, and when I say grassroots movements on criminal legal system issues, that includes both prison and policing, because they're so connected. Those grassroots movements, the most important ones, are happening on the community level. And I think that part of the reason for looking specifically for those opportunities is because that's also the way we're going to build a different world. If we're dealing with problems at their root, and actually dealing with the problems at hand, instead of, again, this blanket state solution to all types of crime, if we're going to do that, that's going to happen from our communities. So these movements for decarceration and abolition and the movements against police violence, all of that organizing that's happening on the community level against those things is also building something. It's building new ways of relating to each other, new ways of talking about these issues, and new ways of conceiving of violence prevention and healing. And so I would definitely encourage people to look at their immediate vicinity and look into those efforts. I would also encourage people to get a pen pal in prison, because I think I talked about it at the beginning of our conversation, how there isn't really a sensitivity to the fact that these are human beings living behind bars. Even if you've digested the fact that we have 2.4 million people in prison, you might not be thinking of them as people. And so reaching out to someone in prison, corresponding with them, and getting to know them on that human level, I think is really crucial. And there are a number of websites where you can just go online and find a pen pal. One of my favorite groups is Black and Pink, which specifically reaches out to LGBTQ prisoners. Also, there are a number of websites like writeaprisoner.com. You kind of have to weed out the websites that are specifically commercial in nature, or that are like forcing you to date a prisoner, which you might not be interested in. I don't know, some people are, but you have to kind of be conscious that websites have certain purposes. But there are so many places out there to seek a pen pal. And to me, that, especially if you don't have a lot of time in your day to like be an activist, that's something that you can do just right up front.
So I guess to me, one of the takeaways from this conversation is that rather than responding to harm, to crime, to prison and justice as a federal issue that we should expect our government to take care of, it's an individual and it's a community response that's needed, if not equally, perhaps more. Yeah?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that this is about not kind of like pushing people in power so much. That's part of it. But it's not the main impetus for a movement beyond prison. I think the movement beyond prison starts with the way we live our lives day to day. And that's a lot scarier. It's a larger undertaking, but it's our responsibility.
Absolutely.
The way I see it.
Absolutely. Well, Maya, I can't thank you enough for spending the time with me today, for writing Lockdown, Locked Out, for doing the research that was important to create it, and also for bearing and including your personal story with your sister, and how that sensitized you to the larger ramifications of our prison system. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Pleasure.
Let's make a resolution this year to begin the work of refashioning our justice system to mirror our hopes, not our fears. Let's make policies as if they will be inflicted upon our loved ones instead of some nameless, faceless strangers. And let's treat those who wind up on the other side of the law as if they're going to get out, because they most likely will. For Maya Schenwar, I'm Peter Bermudez for Arlington Public News.